Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thanks for joining us for the second part of today's VPA Day at the Capitol. We are fortunate to have Aimee Perron Seibert, who is the lobbyist for us here at VPA, and someone with many, many years of experience in the Virginia General Assembly as our speaker today. So her session is titled Virginia Budget 101, and we all can learn a lot more about the budget, so I'm looking forward to it. She's going to present a lot of information and unpack the mysterious world of the budget and give us expert insights into the process that they use as our lobbying team. As in the last session, the attendees will be muted during the session and presenters will have the chance. You can all ask questions as we go along. You can type those into the chat feature, the questions chat feature, or raise your hand because Aimee can see you since we're all on camera. And she'll try to answer your questions as she goes along. Just a little bit about Aimee. She's a founding partner of Commonwealth Strategy Group, which brings over 20 years of experience in legislative advocacy. They represent clients ranging from large companies to nonprofits and small businesses. Aimee serves as VPA's lead lobbyist and also specializes in other types of lobbying, including healthcare, transportation, gaming, and business issues, with expertise in coalition building and grassroots organizing. She holds a BA from Boston College and a master's in social work policy from VCU, a graduate of the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership. She serves on the Maimon Foundation board, and she lives in Richmond with her husband and two daughters. Aimee was supposed to be joined by her colleague, Henry Watkins, but Henry is doing his civic duty today. He has been called for jury duty. So sorry that we can't have Henry, but maybe some other time. So I'll turn it over to you, Aimee.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Appreciate you being here. I had asked Betsy and the folks at VPA to make this a more interactive presentation if possible. So please feel free, if I'm talking, I will try to see if I can see your hand raised. I can't see everybody as I'm doing the presentation. So if you just want to, honestly, if you want to just yell out and stop me, I am perfectly fine with that. I know this topic can be a little dry. So if you've got some questions that you want me to answer when we're going along, I will be happy to do that. But going to do my best to kind of give you just sort of a pretty big overview of how the budget process works. We thought this was obviously a timely presentation since next week the governor will be releasing his budget when everything sort of starts here for real in the 2025 session. So I'll go ahead and get started. Here we go. Okay, so for the first part of how the budget starts, and I think this is some of the pieces that I think we don't always know, like how early it starts, but what ends up happening is really, quite truthfully, after the General Assembly session is done in the spring, agencies start already looking at what they're going to be doing for the next year. So they start sort of their internal process of looking at their own budgets and what they're going to need to complete their budget for the next year. And so what's happening is that, starting in June, I think is really where, and probably a little bit before that, agencies begin their internal process in looking at how to determine their budget priorities and what they're going to look at. And they take the summer and they work on that. And then in August, DPB, which is the Department of Planning and Budget, which is essentially the governor's arm who writes the entire budget. So they have, just like Senate Finance and House Appropriations has, they have staff members who are dedicated to all the different sections of the budget and all the different secretariats. And those staff members issue instructions to the agencies about how they're going to do their requests. So in September, agencies generate those requests and submit them into the secretary's office as well. And then once they go for the secretary's office, they go through that process, and then the secretary's office approves from their agencies what they want to send to the governor's office. And then they send that information to the governor's office. So there's quite a few different paring down options and places that happen really behind the scenes within the executive branch. And then, as we all know, sort of October, November is the time when the governors, when DPB and the Secretary of Finance and all the folks are working together to craft the governor's policy policy agenda and everything that's going to be in that budget. So what their priorities are going to be. And they really have to have everything completed no later than early December, because they still have to get it done and they have to get the budget printed. And as we all know, that takes a while. So that's about a 2-week process. So essentially, the budget is probably going to be completed by this weekend at the latest. And so, like I said, it takes about a week to print the budget, and that comes out next week. So this is when it all happens. Obviously, we always consider it to be sort of the first day of school, when the governor comes in next week and releases the budget to the entire House Appropriations, House Finance, and Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee. And so that'll be next week. And that's what happens. And then from there, what happens is in January, obviously that budget bill gets referred to the committees, and the Senate and House members start working on those. In February, conference committees get appointed, they get worked on, and the budget gets worked out. And then in March, everything gets finished, hopefully. Well, this year it'll be February, everything gets finished and sent to the governor. The governor then reviews and signs the budget, or he sends it back with amendments, and they have to handle those in April. So that's sort of just the general timeline. And we can move on from there. Oops. Okay. So like I said, the big players obviously in the budget starts off in the executive branch with which the governor gets to really lead that process. And I know it's always one of those really sort of interesting things is that, when a new governor starts, they're always working off the old governor's budget, which is always an interesting thing. So for example, next year in 2025, Governor Youngkin will put forward a biennial budget. So a 2-year budget that he will put forward, present to the General Assembly in December of 2025, and then a new governor will take over in January. That could be a governor of the same party, or that could be a governor of a new party, but that everybody works off of that same budget regardless, which I think is always a very sort of uniquely Virginia thing that we do here. And so, this year, we are in the second year of a biennial budget, so this is just a year where we're going to be doing amendments to that budget. As you guys know from last year, we had a 2-year budget and we had to have a couple different special sessions because we needed a budget to pass. Something had to be in place by July 1 to govern the agencies and just Virginia's budget in general, so we can make sure everybody got paid and people or agencies got the allocations they needed. This year, sort of uniquely, I guess, again, because it is the second year of the biennial budget, technically you don't need a budget in January. So that is always something that is out there as a possibility, that there may be no amendments made to the budget. I think that's only happened, I think maybe one time that I can remember in history, and it was under the Gilmore administration, when they did not pass a second year of the biennial budget. But that's always something that is like sort of out there as a potential threat. So the governor, like we said, we always call it, he gets the first bite of the apple when allocating all the resources. But it's important that we all know that the Constitution says the General Assembly is actually the only one who can appropriate funds. It's actually not the governor. He can make recommendations, but the General Assembly has to approve them and do that. And so I think that's an important piece for us to know as well. So like I said, the governor gives them the budget, and then the General Assembly takes all that time during session to work on the budget. The first Friday, I think actually that's my next slide. Actually, I won't skip ahead. So the Money Committee is, like we said, Senate reviews all the spending proposals in the Senate Finance Committee. So they do everything there. So they do the taxing, AKA raising the revenues, and then also determining how they're going to spend the money, all on the Senate Finance Committee. 15 members, chaired by Senator Louise Lucas. There are 10 subcommittees that are sort of separated out by function area. And they are technically the only committee in the General Assembly to have full-time professional staff. So there is a Senate Finance Committee of staff members who also are broken up by their areas of expertise. And they're the ones that work on the budget and writing all those different sections. So they become real subject matter experts when they're doing that work. On the House side, there are 2 committees that deal with the budget issues. House Finance is the one that reviews all the sort of taxing and raising of the revenues. And then the Appropriations Committee does all the spending. So any bills that deal with taxes have to go to House Finance and then get referred to Appropriations. And so they have a 2-committee process for that. Finance is chaired by Delegate Watts, and Appropriations is chaired by Delegate Torian, with Mark Sickles as the vice chair. And these committees also do meet regularly outside of session. They receive lots of presentations. I think the House Appropriations and Senate Finance committees meet throughout the year. They often, almost every single meeting has a presentation from whoever the Secretary of Finance is. So obviously Secretary Cummings has been coming to all those meetings and giving them updates on what the revenue looks like, what's the outlook for Virginia, like what's going on from a big picture standpoint. So they stay up to date on that throughout the entire year, not just during the General Assembly session. Okay, so the amendment process, and this is the part where we sort of get down to where the General Assembly starts really kind of cutting apart and taking all the pieces of what the governor put in there and tries to start changing it. And so what happens is there's a process where all members of the General Assembly, 140 members, can submit budget amendments. And so what they do is those are due on the first Friday of session. So this year that will be January 10th. They usually have to have them in by that date. And the members have to have them submitted. They have to be drafted accordingly. They all have, both the House Appropriations and Senate Finance has special forms on their websites that the members have to fill out and submit to the members. They are now all submitted electronically. They used to be submitted by hand. They don't do that anymore. Everything has to be submitted electronically, and they can honestly submit as many budget amendments as they want. So there's no limit on budget amendments. Obviously, and there's no monetary limit either. So sometimes you can look and see how many amendments members have submitted, because you can search on the system after they come out by member, and you can see how much they have submitted. And you can also kind of try to do some additions. Some members do submit quite a bit of revenue where they try to spend a lot of money. So there's when you're looking at from a citizen standpoint or activist or advocacy standpoint or lobbying standpoint, like with me, it's important to figure out who's going to be your budget patron. And obviously the preference is usually the members of those committees. And then you kind of pare it down from there. It goes from the committees to the subcommittee members. Because if you're working on a very specific subject, you want the people who are going to be working and talking about those areas to be the ones that carry your budget amendments. The folks that submit budget amendments who are not committee members do get an opportunity to present them to the committee. And that happens during session. After the members submit the amendments, there is a hearing on each side, the Senate and the House, where non-committee members can come and just talk about their amendments. And they literally just get up there and talk about them. There's no discussion, there's no votes, there's nothing. It's just an opportunity for the non-members to be able to do that, because everybody else just talks about their budget amendments within those subcommittee hearings and those and the private meetings that they have. Everything is really debated behind the scenes by those relevant subcommittees before they make recommendations to everybody else. Does anybody have any questions yet? And I'm sorry, I'm trying to see if anybody has their hand raised or anything. No? Okay. Okay, I will keep going. Oh, Betsy, yes.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding you correctly, there is less public participation in these budget hearings. And even if there is public participation, the real discussions take place behind closed doors. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, that's right. That's right. That is an accurate statement. And that's honestly historically been the way the budget has been deliberated for decades. I think it's more public than it used to be, but I still think it is a very sort of private conversation that happens. And a lot of that is because they really have to really hash out all the different, the different monies and different priorities, and having those conversations can get really in the past, they have gotten very vociferous, I think, between the different parties. And I think it's also important to note that when the party's in control, so for example, obviously here right now we have the Democrats in control. Those are the folks who are really writing the budget and making the decisions about budget amendments. The minority party doesn't have quite as much say in the budgeting process. Now, that's not to be said that they don't have, that their colleagues don't listen to them or that they're not part of the process. They certainly are. But I would just say that the budget priorities and what the budget looks like is really determined by the party in power, whether that's the Republicans or the Democrats. And I think that's not a surprise, but it's just something that I think happens. I think when either any of the minority parties, when you have budget amendments put in by those folks, they have less of a chance of getting included in the budget than the folks who are of the primary party. That is definitely for sure. Obviously, the budget deliberations happen I think all of us who work in the General Assembly know that that legislators are giant procrastinators. So while they have 5 weeks to conduct this budget review, they really start reviewing and dealing with the budget about a week and a half to 2 weeks before the budget is really due, which, as you can imagine, can be a very frenetic and crazy process because all the folks who are working on the budget are also on lots of other committees. A lot of them are chairing other committees and they're working on other stuff. So a lot of those meetings happen in the evening or in the early morning hours. Typically, I feel like when you start really seeing, especially the week before the budget comes out, it is impossible, if not very, very difficult, to find the members of those subcommittees to be able to talk to them about any of the budget items because they're all in those meetings because they're doing those small committee meetings with the staff. Typically up on the House Appropriations and Senate Finance floor. They're not in their offices, they're upstairs doing all that work. They even have, they have plenty of conference rooms. When they built the new building, they built in conference rooms and subcommittee rooms on those floors for the members to be able to work on this budget process. Budget's released on what they call Budget Sunday, a great time, and we all get to come to the Capitol on a Sunday during session and hear what each house has come up with. And so that's when you hear what the Senate priorities are going to be and what the House priorities are going to be. And then at that point, what you realize, and I'm sure all of you as members of the media start looking to see where they differ. So what's the House got as their priorities? What's the Senate have as their priorities? Where do they start being different? Because this is the part where you have to get those two budgets to be the same and be able to pass into one budget. And so after those budgets come out, those committee conference reports come out, then what happens is the members get a chance to read those budgets and they get debated on that Thursday on the floor where floor amendments can be offered. Most often, floor amendments are not adopted unless something really got left out of the budget that everybody on the House Appropriations or Senate Finance Committee agrees to. Generally, the feeling is that if it's not included in the budget, they do not accept floor amendments. So there'll be debate on them, and people will put in amendments to remove things from the budget or to add things to the budget, and that conversation happens on the floor, but it is very rare for anything to actually get included as a floor amendment.
Aimee, we have a question. Do you want to answer that?
Oh, yes, of course.
Question from Lauren Hines Acosta at the Chesapeake Bay Journal.
Yeah.
Ask, are there ways to track budget request amendments or attend committee meetings? See, I'm reading in a small thing. See or see the debate over these changes. What's the best way to follow the budget changing?
Yeah, so that is a very good and very tricky question. So a couple good things. Virginia does have, I still think, some of the best sort of online systems for tracking bills and for the budget. So when you go on to the LIS, the Legislative Information System, there is a whole section for the budget. Once the budget is released by the governor, it goes up there and then you can see the entire budget and it's broken out by secretariat. And I'm going to show you that a little bit later. But what happens is when the amendments are submitted by all the members, those also get posted and they get posted on the same set of the page, and it will say budget amendments, and you can sort them by member, so you can look at them by member, or you can sort them by item number and secretariat. So you can look at all the different amendments that were submitted. It gets a little tricky after that because what happens is then what you see is then there'll be subcommittee reports. You'll have the sort of House version of the budget and the Senate version of the budget. You can't quite tell which members' amendments were included, except for being able to sort of match them up by looking at, like, I'll use an example. I'll say, like, okay, so you can look and see what Patrick Hope requested. And then the only way that you'll know which amendments got adopted is if you really go to the section that you're looking for to see if that amendment that he put in was adopted into the House version of the budget. And then after that, what gets hard too is, like, once the House version and Senate version comes out, and then you get a conference report, which is released at usually on the last day of session, going through and seeing those differences can also be difficult. I will say this budget staff does a good job of giving presentations to their members. And so, like, the House Appropriations Committee will do, like, when they release the conference report on that, like, last day of session, they will always break and then go do presentations. So, like, Senate finance staff will say, hey, here's what's in the conference report that differs from what we had in the budget, and the Senate and House Appropriations will do the same. So they try to do a pretty good job of that. They also have to release now, this is something that was kind of new in the last, I guess, 5 to 7 years. There has to be a page in that presentation that they give everybody that shows you things that are included in the final conference report that were in neither budget. So there is a whole section that can be like, for example, it wasn't in the House budget that was released on Budget Sunday or the Senate budget, but somehow there are still things that get included in the conference report because that happens. Sometimes, there are some priorities that either got left out or someone makes a really good argument for something getting put in. Or honestly, something could happen in Virginia or in the economy where they need to add another piece in there. So, but there is from a transparency standpoint, they do have to have a list that shows you all the things that were not included in either budget. So they'll be like, those are like the very new items. So I hope that answers the question. But from a standpoint of the budget debate, I would say you can watch on Budget Sunday, you can watch them release the budgets. I would not say there's a lot of debate and there's not a lot of information. What they really do is the subcommittee chairs get up and present. They usually read like a speech that talks about their priorities, and then the staff releases online what that subcommittee. So for example, like natural resources, like the House Natural Resources Subcommittee, what they'll do is they'll stand up, they'll give a speech, and then the staff will release the information online so you can click on it and you can see what is included in those budget amendments, what budget amendments were in there. Now, another caveat, and it always gets hard, not all the half sheets are always included on Sunday. They have to have all the half sheets is what they call the explanations for the budget amendments are up by that following Tuesday. So they have 2 more days to get all the actual like language right and everything released. And so being able to see what's really in those 2 budgets, it's usually that we all wait out, like all of us call it the day when the half sheets come out. So we're always like, when's the half sheets coming out? And so that'll be the actual explanation as opposed to just a spreadsheet. Because sometimes they just have a spreadsheet of what's in that different section. And you're like, I don't know if my stuff's in there. Sometimes things are just language amendments. And so you wouldn't see those until Tuesday either. So if it doesn't have any money attached to it, which we talk about a little bit later, is when people legislate through the budget. Sometimes those language amendments are you can't see those till Tuesday. So hopefully that helps. Okay. Okay, so like I said, the bills are debated on that Thursday on the House side and the Senate side. And then what happens is they're sent over to the other side where they are rejected and then placed into a committee of conference. And so that happens every year. No one ever accepts the other person's budget. It's the whole point is to get them into a conference committee. And that's when you see who's appointed to the conference committee. And usually it's about the same people. The Senate has a certain number of budget conferees from their side. They have members of the majority party and at least 1 or 2 members of the minority party as conferees, and the same thing on the House side. And so what happens is it sort of gets winnowed down from the 2 big committees making decisions to now just this list of people. And the numbers of the conference committees kind of vary year to year and depending on who's in charge. But usually it's somewhere between 12 to 18 members that really are working on the budget. So those are the conferees. They end up being the hardest people to find for the rest of session. And because everybody wants to talk to them about including their stuff in the budget. And so they're the ones that are making those final determinations. And what they do is they go and they have meetings where the House members and the Senate members get together on the different topics. And so the conferees are assigned different topic areas, like some of the members, like for example, like Mark Sickles would usually have health as one of his issues because he's the chair of of the HHS committee. And so he does a lot of the health stuff. He probably has another area that he is also negotiating on. And then there's a senator that's also assigned to health. And those 2 people sit down and kind of hash out and they try to work out with the staff. So the House Appropriations and Senate Finance health staff will be in a room and they'll all try to hash out the differences between those different reports, and they try to make it into one report where they basically decide like, oh, that's your priority, that's our priority. How do we figure out which ones are going to make it into that final version? So all that discussion happens usually in the last 2 weeks of session. Okay, next. So legislative impact. And so I think, this is obviously an issue from a legislation standpoint. How does that sort of interact with the budget committees? Because the budget committees not only write the budget, but they also have to deal with bills that have a financial impact. So, there's quite a few bills that have fiscal impacts. Fiscal impact statements are supposed to be attached to bills. That doesn't happen always in a timely fashion. The Department of Planning and Budget is the one that does those fiscal impact statements. And they're also very heavily reliant upon the agencies themselves to do those impacts. And so I think that's something that's important to know. So for example, if there's a bill out there that affects the Medicaid department, for example, the Medicaid program, DPB will come up with a fiscal impact statement, but they will talk to Medicaid and ask them what they think this bill will cost them. And so there is some opportunity there for people in different agencies, if they don't want something to pass, to give it a really big fiscal impact. And so that's just something to kind of keep in mind. And I'm not saying that everybody games the system that way, but just know that like there's a strong chance if there's something out there that has a really high fiscal impact, sometimes it may not be the most accurate fiscal impact, because it might be something where they're like, this is going to be really hard for us to do, and they can throw a big fiscal impact on there in the hopes that it might kill the bill, right? Because if it has a really big fiscal impact, what happens is when it goes through its committee of origin, it has a fiscal impact, it also has to be sent over to the House Finance the House Appropriations or Senate Finance Committee. So it gets a second referral. So it'll pass a committee. And what happens is essentially the idea is, but this is not always the way it works, is that committee of origin votes on the policy, right? They're like, okay, we think this policy is important, even though it has a fiscal impact. We want it to go over to the Appropriations Committee. And then the Appropriations Committee is supposed to be looking at that bill just from a financial standpoint, which doesn't always happen. So they're really looking, it's kind of honestly what ends up happening lately is it's a second look at the policy. But really this was we looking at, okay, our colleague said this is an important policy, but do we have the money to pay for this? And this is where it comes in, where sometimes it's really important that if you have that bill, like as the patron of the bill, say, I'll use Patrick Hope as an example again. Patrick Hope has a bill that he put in. It has a fiscal impact. The question always comes when you go to the Appropriations Committee, hey, Delegate Hope, did you put a budget amendment in for this? And so the answer is that usually there are members who try to put budget amendments in that match their legislation to ensure that the conversation can happen. And he would say, yes, I did put a budget amendment in. I hope that will be considered when you are looking through the budgetary process. And that can help that bill pass out of appropriations because that bill, because there is a budget amendment that could, it's sort of technically pay for that bill to pass, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a combination piece sometimes that happens, which is important. So if there is nothing that is not, if it's not accounted for, there's a much stronger chance that bill gets killed in that Appropriations or Finance Committee, because they're going to say, hey, look, like you didn't put a budget amendment in, we didn't have this, we're not prepared to pay for this year, we're going to table this bill for the year because we don't have the money to pay for it, and that bill's dead for the year. So that is definitely one way a bill can die, is if it has a high fiscal impact and there is no money for it in the budget. The Senate committee has also always had a practice of sometimes they will pass bills that they used to add what they call the clause to it, which basically says if there is no money allocated for this bill will not take effect. And so that was something that they did for years and years. I don't remember if they did that last year or not, but I think under Louise Lucas, I haven't seen the clause attached to many bills as much as it had under previous Senate Finance chair, men and women. That was something that they would put on there, and they called that the clause. And when the bill would go over to the House would usually try to remove the clause, and there would be a fight about that. Okay, next. So then the other piece that I think we always hear quite a bit about is the comment of, are you legislating through the budget? Which is something that used to happen much more rarely, but I think I would say in the last 10 to 15 years happens quite frequently, where policy decisions are also made in the budgetary process, as opposed to it just being made in the statute. Now you can, and I have seen, and I think it happened last year, where they would put an entire bill in the back of the budget as a way to keep something alive. So you can actually put an entire statute in the budget, and that still could become law that way. Now, typically those things, when they do that, that's really just a ploy for one side or the other to show that that's a priority for them. Those usually do not make it into the final budget where there's an actual like statute with all the language in there. However, there is quite a bit of language that gets included in the budget that does change policy, because I think the most important thing for everybody to remember, no matter what, is that the budget supersedes any bill that passed. So if a bill passes and then there's something in the budget that either renders that either useless, that is what always wins. The budget will always win. It's sort of in a game of rock, paper, scissors. You're talking bill here, budget here, it's always winning, no matter what. So that's why it's important when you talk about the whole issue of legislating through the budget, because that is going to be the superseding piece in that issue. Next. All right, budget structure. This is probably going to be a little bit more on the boring side, so I'm going to try to go through some of this a little bit faster. Okay, so revenue sources, we have a general fund. That is the part where the income, corporate, and sales tax is part of that. Used for any purpose. This is a general fund. You can be using it for education, healthcare, oh, healthcare's in there twice, sorry about that. Public safety and social services. Direct aid to education and DMAS make up half this budget. So those are the pieces that are quite a bit of the entire general fund. Non-general fund money is money that is less fungible, I guess I would call it. It's federal revenues, it's tuition tax and fees, gas tax, lottery, unemployment tax, tobacco taxes. It's all things that are earmarked for a specific purpose. So non-general funds have a very specific purpose. General funds are just that. They are general. They can be used for anything. And so those are the two big sort of pieces of the budget, are those two different types of revenue sources. This is just sort of just a chart to kind of show you where all those things kind of fall into when you're talking about the different parts of the revenue sources. And obviously this is something you can have and we share with you later. And then when you read the budget, which I think is the other piece that sort of goes along with this, is that you're kind of looking through the different parts of the budget and kind of trying to see what everything is, right? And so the big part is the operating expenses. That's part one of the budget, appropriates all the general and non-general funds by agency in major areas of the budget: legislative, judicial, executive, and independent agencies. It sets out the authority for the funding, like the General Assembly is authorized by this article of the Constitution to do X, Y, Z. Most items also include language dictating the parameters for the use of the appropriated funds, and includes totals for each agency and program. Totals are broken out by fund sources. Again, very, very dense part of this whole conversation. Capital expenses, those are all the sort of like the big things, right? The building of stuff and the big pieces of the budget. Obviously, the biggest part often of this is all the stuff in higher ed. I think people talk about, when you talk about the capital part of the budget, higher education is a huge part of that because they're always talking about building different new buildings, more dorms, et cetera, et cetera. But all the universities are a big piece of the capital budget, as is things like building the General Assembly building. That falls under that piece. Like what's going to happen with the Monroe building, that falls under the capital budget, right? Like what happens to those buildings, it's that piece. They also set out the parameters of how you're going to spend it. They're all listed with the distinct numbers, like section C1. And then they also talk about maintenance reserve funding allocation. So like there's pieces that are in there too. And then there's all the parts about revenues and revenue bonds, a part of the capital expenses. General provisions, this is part 4 of the budget, sets out provisions and conditions that govern all appropriations in the act. And for the governor as the chief budget officer, this is where you talk about withholding of spending authority, the process for handling a shortfall in general fund revenues, authority to transfer appropriations within the act between programs, agencies, or fiscal years, and the authority to increase non-general fund appropriations administratively, like giving the governor the ability to do that in the off season. And it really sets out the governor's process and authority on general fund balances at the end of the year. Additional enactments. This is the part of the budget I would always say, make sure you take a look at part 4. This is where there's some little things that can be snuck in the budget. This is the parts of the budget where you might be like, oh, I don't know what part 4 is. I would always encourage you to click on that section and look what's in there, because those are where sometimes you find little nuggets of fun things that you would like, oh, I didn't know what that would be. Because it's essentially things that don't fall anywhere else in the budget. And you want to put something in there, you put them in part 4 in the additional enactments piece. And so sometimes you see little surprises in there, which I always find a piece that I actually go look at first all the time. Okay. So this will go back to the original question too. So when you get the budget, what you can do is this is what it kind of looks like. I can't click on anything here. It's just sort of a static page. But this will sort of show you the different sections of the budget. And this is how you can start looking for things. I find this to be sort of the easiest way to do it, because once you go here, you can click through and you continue to click down and you kind of can really get into the different sections. So for example, I think healthcare is on here, Office of Health and Human Resources. So if you go to that, then you click on that, and then it sort of breaks everything down. You'll have the Department of Health in there. You'll have Department of Medicaid Services. You will have OES in there, emergency services. And so you can kind of start seeing that. And then when you click on that section, you can see all the amendments that fall under those categories. And that's where you can start really seeing what budget amendments were included in what's done. So for example, here we can look here. This is sort of a higher ed. You can see the State Council of Higher Education. You can see sort of like how much money is in here, right? These are the big top numbers. what's great about this year's budget, which I think is much easier than the biennial budget, because this is the second year of the biennial, you will see crossouts and add-ins, which is much more helpful because when they write a new budget, everything looks brand new, but everything is not brand new. And that makes it hard because you really have to know what was in there before and not what was there. So it's not like a bill where everything has to be italicized when it's the brand new budget. However, this year's budget, they do have to do that because it is an amendment. These are all amendments. Even what the governor's doing for next week is an amendment to the budget. So language will be italicized and there'll be strike throughs and replaced numbers. So you get to see a little bit more. I think I will tell you the second year of the budget is much easier to read than the first year of the budget because you have to really be like, oh, great. A lot of the times I end up having on my desk a budget from like the final budget from the year before and the brand new budget in hard copy. And I will have to go through section by section and try to read and see what's different because you don't have any of that sort of the what we expect, which is the italicized pieces or underlined or strike throughs in the biennial budget. And that makes it hard. But this year will be a little bit easier. So be grateful for that. And I think it's a much more helpful piece. Let's see, there's an example. So like this is for the Medicaid program services. So these are the parts where you can see all the different numbers. And when you actually look at the budget amendments, you can also see the different amendments that were added to this section. And so everything can be broken up by different department, which is really a helpful thing. So item 304, this case is the Medicaid program. So that is basically the meat of it all. I think if I exit this, hopefully maybe we can go back to, I don't know if Betsy or somebody, I don't know, how do we get back to the full screen of everybody being able to?
That would be Dino who'll do that for us.
There we go. Perfect. Okay, awesome. Great. I know that was a lot of information, and the budget is a lot of information. That isn't obviously everything I can tell you, but I would love to answer any questions, or if you've got anything you is a burning desire to ask me about, I am happy to answer that for you. Yes, Betsy.
Looks like we have another question.
Okay.
Also from Lauren Heinz Acosta. There are rumors that there's a surplus in the budget this year. Is that true? Is there a way to verify that?
Yes, I mean, there is a budget surplus. I mean, I think what's always tricky about it, and truthfully, I think this is where it gets a little bit complicated, and this is where the media can be really helpful, is really trying to be able to talk to the legislators and to the governor about what that really means. There is a surplus. However, there's always quite a lot of things where there's spending that we have to do in Virginia. And when there's spending that you have to do, that gets taken off that sort of surplus. It goes into those categories. But there is a surplus of money. I don't remember the exact number of what it is, but there is a surplus. There'll be money that will be able to be spent this year. I don't know if anybody here went to the House Appropriations or Senate Finance retreats that are always held the week before Thanksgiving. House Appropriations was all the way down in Abingdon, and the Senate Finance Retreat was in Harrisonburg this year. But those are really good opportunities, and all that information is posted on the Senate Finance and House Appropriations website. So they have all their presentations. That's a great source of information to be able to really kind of dig into what the surplus is. They do a really good job of doing that too by section. And so I think that's a great place for you to go look, and so you can kind of get a better way to verify what that surplus looks like. But that's really where they start kind of giving you not only just the details, but also that you get a real sense of like what their priorities are going to be at that retreat that they do. I will say that overall, what I think I heard from both the House and the Senate this year is they're going to be really cautious this year with spending all the money that we have as a surplus, because I think everybody is very, very hesitant about what's going to happen at the federal level. Or we're talking about, if are there going to be cuts to the Medicaid program? Like, is the federal government going to like cut their share? Because the Medicaid program is a program that's shared between the federal government and the state. It's usually a 50-50 split. During COVID, the split was much more favorable, where it was a much higher federal split, and we had to pay a much less amount of money. It's gone back to being more of a 50-50 split. But if the feds, stop paying as much as they do now, does that mean that we have to start paying more, or do we cut the rolls for Medicaid? So there's a lot of decisions that might have to be made based on the fact that we have a brand new president that will be starting in January. So I heard a lot of I think there's a lot of caution, I think, by the Senate Finance and House Appropriations staff and also the members about maybe not spending all that money and being a little bit more cautious. What we always hear, and it's something that you guys will hear quite a bit, is what they say is like what they want to do is use that money for one-time spending. One-time spending means that they don't want to spend this on something that is an ongoing cost. For example, they don't want to, like I guess I'm trying to think like staff or like hire more staff for things because that's an ongoing expense. Like they don't want to do that. They don't want to create a new program that's going to cost, $10 million. That's going to cost $10 million this year, next year, and the year after. They're looking for like projects and things that are single one-time use. And that's what they call one-time spending. They prefer to spend that with surplus money because they're like, okay, we can spend this one time. We don't have to worry about it being a reoccurring expense because that's something that's going to be on the books forever. And they're going to be a lot more cautious with any of those types of expansions.
Aimee, there was a question. What is the total amount of the current budget?
That's a great question. I think it's about $75 billion. It's
Wow.
somewhere, it's like 70 to 75 billion in the biennial budget. So over 2 years.
Wow. And then another question, aren't there splits in several areas of the budget? For example, education and transportation?
I'm not sure what that means.
I don't.
I asked the question.
Oh, okay.
I worked at the Virginia Department of Transportation, and there's the portion of the budget that is maintenance and state roads, and then there's the portion of the budget that's building an interstate, which is federal money. So that's why I was asking the question.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. I mean, the transportation budget is probably one of the most prescriptive parts of the budget where everything is divided up between like all the revenues that come out in the federal piece and also all the state money, like all the gas tax money that comes in, all the different types of revenue and how it's all divided. I work in transportation and like the funding structure looks like a giant spider web because there's so many allocations that go from different pieces to different parts. It's probably one of the most complicated pieces of the budget, to be honest, because of the federal and state spending and because of all the tax revenue that comes in and that varies on a year-to-year basis.
Right.
So it can be difficult. Mm-hmm. Yes.
We have a question from Michelle Smith from the Northern Neck News.
Okay.
Recently, the Department of Taxation made a presentation to the Joint Subcommittee on Tax Policy, presenting research about revenue Virginia was missing by not taxing certain services. Would a presentation like that and the research presented be something the subcommittee commissioned, or would it be something the Department of Taxation reached out and offered to present?
So that's a great question. I believe what that was because I actually attended those like 2 meetings that were held. So Delegate Watts is the chair of that commission. And it has been kind of a priority, I think, of hers and of the commission itself is to kind of start looking at different revenue options, honestly, looking at different streams for the revenue. Are there different options out there? That's what that commission was looking at. So they requested that study from the staff, and I'm sure the staff went out and got that information from the Department of Taxation and a whole lot of different sources. So they had to do that research. The staff for the tax commission had to do that. The restructuring committee, what they did say is that this is something they're looking at. I don't think there's going to be a lot of changes this year because again, this is such a short session. They don't typically try to tackle big issues like changing taxes and things in such a short session. But that's something that I know is important to this General Assembly. Now, obviously that could be different if the General Assembly changes in November after the elections, but I do think that you could see in 2026 some new tax sources. I think they've talked a little bit about that, looking at services. Louise Lucas had that there was a budget, I think that was last year or the year before they had that, and then it ended up not getting included in the final budget. But there's quite a bit of discussion about different revenue sources. That conversation will continue for sure.
We have another question from Natalie Anderson of Virginia Media. She says, did I hear right that those retreat reports are available online? If so, how can they be accessed?
Yes. So if you just Google Virginia Senate Finance Committee or Virginia House Appropriations Committee member, you can go there and you can look at their meetings. So if you look on their under their meetings categories, you can find all the different links. And so they'll have links to all the presentations from those retreats. And so they were held in November. So if you I think they post them by date. So if you look at the November meetings for Senate Finance and House Appropriations, all the meeting materials will be there, and all those presentations will be there so that you can go through. And they'll talk about kind of like what it looks like in all the different like areas, like for example, like how they think the Medicaid funding, Medicaid has like a 600, I think it's about a $600 million hole in their budget. So like that's going to be a number that they're going to have to use some of this surplus to fix. And so there's things like that in those presentations.
Okay, and thanks to Alice Bryan Campo, she shared a link to that. So
oh, great. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I could have tried. I don't think I can do that and talk at the same time.
We have another question, is if I want to have a bill passed that impacts policy, how do I find out what, if any, fiscal impact it has? Do I do this before I reach out to a legislative sponsor, or do I take the idea to the legislator and let him determine the fiscal impact?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think it can happen either way. I think it sort of depends. If you're going to do a bill that you proactively want, that you know is going to cost a certain amount of money. For example, it's like if you wanted to change something, I don't know if I can think of an example right off the top of my head, but if you know, like, for example, I want to put a bill in to create a new program and that new program costs X, then you would obviously be able to tell that legislator, like, we want to put this language in the statute, but it's going to have this fiscal impact. You might know that right off the top of your head. You may not know the answer to that. Like if you have an idea and you go to a legislator and you say, I want to do X, Y, Z, they can say, does that have a fiscal impact? And you can say, I'm not sure. And then what they can do is they can always reach out to the agency that it impacts and see if they can tell them beforehand what they think that could cost. That is definitely one way to do it. You can also talk to the House Appropriations or Senate Finance staff. Sometimes that works too. You can say, hey, I've got this bill idea. What do you think this would cost? Would this be an issue? And you can talk to folks that way as well. But a lot of times when people put budget amendments in, for example, like the legislators are, putting those amendments in often at the request of other people, whether citizens in their district, it could be members of their, of their local supervisors or their, that need a budget amendment, or it could be, folks like me, who are asking for different, any of our clients that want budget amendments too. So there's lots of different ways that legislators get budget amendments, and then those numbers probably have to be usually given by the person making the request. Sometimes you don't know the answer to that too, but then the Senate Finance and House Appropriations staff has to come up with that number. Yes.
That's all the questions that we have right now. If anybody would like to raise their hands. Betsy?
Right. Betsy?
Yeah, I guess I never thought that a citizen could approach DPB or House Budget or Senate Finance. And I guess what my concern would be is I have this idea, the legislator asked me what the fiscal impact is. I don't know the answer to that. And then the legislator becomes less interested in supporting my bill because he or she is going to have to mess around with fiscal impact. It would seem to me bills that have no fiscal impact are easier to lobby on than bills that do have fiscal impact.
Oh, definitely. I mean, and don't get me wrong, it would be difficult as a citizen to be able to reach out to Senate Finance and House Appropriations staff. I would definitely say that what you would do is you'd be working with that legislator and ask that legislator to make those connections or to make those requests themselves. Obviously, those staff members respond to legislators better than they respond to anybody outside of the world. So I would always, sort of encourage people to have the legislator themselves make those requests to the staff members. And obviously, the earlier you do it, the better everybody appreciates it, meaning those House and Senate staff members would love to have that question asked of them in July, as opposed to asked on December 12th.
One more question.
Yeah.
Obviously, the legislature is divided between Republicans and Democrats. If you have a legislator who's in the minority, do you stand as good a chance of getting your budget amendment through or your bill with its fiscal impact through as you would if you had, I mean, do you still try for that? I mean, do they have some clout on the conference committee? I don't know.
So it depends. I would say it depends. And a lot of it depends on that legislator's relationship with the party in power. I don't think it's any secret that Senator Todd Pillion, who is a pediatric dentist from Southwest Virginia, who serves on the Senate Finance Committee, he also serves as a budget conferee, has a really good relationship with all the Democrats on the Senate Finance Committee, and he is really an important part of those conversations. Like they look to him for healthcare expertise. He gets to help drive what's in the budget. So, but a lot of that is personality and how people and what people's relationships are. And so I think that's important. There are some other legislators, some other Republicans who serve on those budget committees who may not have that same relationship with the party in power. And so you kind of have to know, how people get along with everybody else. I would say in general, though, they're all very collegial who are on those committees, the House Appropriations and Senate Finance Committee, because they're really, they're a special group of people who are writing a budget. I mean, this is a process that is still, I think, very opaque. Even though after I give this presentation, it's still complicated, and there's so many things that happen that we don't know are happening behind the scenes. And so when you're in that little group, I think you become very collegial because you're 22 people and you're 15 people that are working on the budget. Like, not everybody gets that chance, and not many people know what's actually happening. So those relationships, I think, regardless of party, they're still all very tight with each other.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, identify yourself, and ask away before we close the session.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. Appreciate it.
I want to say I've worked at the Virginia General Assembly for 37 years, and I just learned a ton. I mean, I had some idea of how this worked, but I got a really good overview, Aimee, and I thank you for that. And you all as members should know that if you have ongoing questions during the session about the budget or anything about the legislature, Aimee is our resource. So contact me, and I will in turn contact Aimee and get you answers if you have a question about something. So just, well, for that matter, year round, she's our resource. So let us know if you need help or you have a question, and we'll make sure that you get an answer. And Aimee will help with that. So thanks so much for this presentation. I learned a ton. And thanks to all of you for being on the call and participating in VPA Day.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Thanks.
Thanks, Aimee. Bye.